Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. My name is Luis Colon, and I'm a senior developer advocate for the CloudFormation service team in AWS. I've been with the team. We're good? Yeah. I've been with the team almost 3 years. I started in AWS as a software development manager and transitioned to do developer advocacy, and we get to do a lot of meetups and content for our many CloudFormation customers. And I'm joined today by...
Hi everybody, my name is Dan Blanco. I am also a developer advocate. I have been with CloudFormation for 2 years, coming up in 2 weeks. Wow, time goes fast. I started as an engineer, and then when I started talking to more and more customers, I kind of became passionate about the developer advocacy portion. So I transitioned to that, and now I just love talking to folks. After the talk, please come talk to us outside. We'd love to meet you, see what your use case is, and just have a general conversation. All right.
So today we're going to talk about CloudFormation. We're going to cover some things, including many of the newer features that we've released in the last year and a half or so. We're going to concentrate the themes on 3 areas. First, how we're modernizing and extending CloudFormation, looking into the future, looking how to grow CloudFormation in terms of features, in terms of stability, and in terms of programmability. I think that's a word, but I haven't checked.
I think so.
So that's going to be the first part of this. The second part is, since we have a lot of our customers, and we have hundreds of thousands of customers managing millions of resources with CloudFormation, a lot of them do it in fairly complex, large enterprise cases. We'll talk a little bit about the things that we're doing that are very focused to large enterprise. And then we'll spend probably the most of the second half of the time we have here with you here talking about developer productivity, and again adding to this programmability of CloudFormation that you'll see not only today but also in the future becoming a much stronger theme for us. So let's go ahead and get started. This is typically our introduction slide. Before I get too far, I want to find out how many of these people wearing green things are existing CloudFormation customers. So do you use CloudFormation today? And I can give you the feedback of, it looks to me like 2/3, you would say?
That's pretty accurate.
So I'm going to assume that the other people are using perhaps another tool, or perhaps not an infrastructure as code tool, which is fine. Although we strongly recommend that you start looking at that, whether it's CloudFormation or an alternate tool. Get to that point that you can automate these things. You'll thank me when you have hundreds or thousands of resources. Some things to highlight about this process. The basic process for using CloudFormation, for those of you that perhaps don't use it yet, is rather than going into the management console and creating your database manually or your SQS manually, you would write instructions in a declarative format on either JSON, which is the traditional way to do CloudFormation, or YAML. Important thing to highlight is today there's many editors that are YAML friendly and CloudFormation friendly. So have your template authors, whether they're sysadmins, developers, somewhere in between, full stack developers, use an editor that supports CloudFormation plugins. It will make your life a lot easier. We're going to talk about a tool that we open sourced last year that's been very popular. It's a CloudFormation linter, and you can start checking your code right from the moment that you're authoring the code. So I wanted to make that point about that first step. The second step, typical AWS users in general, most of them use the management console, which is fine. Most CloudFormation users also use the browser-based console. But of course, like most of the other services, you can use CloudFormation with the console or CLI or APIs. One of the things that I'll highlight here, and we'll talk a little bit more about pipelines later, is that much like any other code process and everything, yes, you can put these assets in S3 buckets, but ideally you want to control these deployments via pipelines as well. And CloudFormation plays very well with that. We'll speak a little bit about that a little bit later. And then as you're deploying things with CloudFormation, once again, you can do it manually, but 2 of the key benefits that you'll get when you deploy things with CloudFormation is, number 1, as your group of stacks, as a group of resources gets deployed and you start updating those resources, if one of the updates has a failure, CloudFormation keeps your state and is able to roll back to the last known good state. Second, CloudFormation knows about stabilization of resources. So when CloudFormation tells you this resource has been created, we pretty much guaranteeing to you that you'll be able to do a describe or do a list on that resource. If you create your own resources with your API calls, and most of those calls are asynchronous, it will be up to you to go and pull and make sure when that resource, whether it's an instance, whether it's any other type of resource, when that resource is ready. So those are just a couple of things that CloudFormation brings to the table besides the auditability, the repeatability, and the general automation of creating and maintaining resources. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you to carry a couple of slides here on modernizing and extending CloudFormation. Go for it.
Sure, absolutely. So this one is near and dear to my heart because I was actually part of the team that actually worked on redesigning the console. We took a look at the previous console and we said, there are some things that we can improve here. There are some ways that we can make this better. Accessibility was a big one for us. Customers were telling us, hey, the console needs to be better at being accessible. So we decided, let's take this excuse and let's rebuild the whole thing. Let's take a look at all of the user experiences from the top down and let's re-envision them. How can we make these better? How can we make them smarter? How can we make it take less clicks to do things? How can we make it more accessible to all users? And we came out with a redesigned console, and customers in general liked it. But just like any feature that we released, there was a lot of feedback. There were thousands of pieces of feedback, and I didn't read all of them, but I read at least like half, right? And one of the biggest things that we gained from it was that customers tend to use stacks not as like a singleton. They tend to use a stack as part of a greater whole, right? They used to use nested stacks, for example, where one stack does 3 different things and you need to change between stacks often and read different types of events and see different types of resources that are being created. So we took that feedback and we reimagined it again. And we came out with the new redesigned split pane console, where you can say, hey, given this stack, that's a parent stack, show me all of the children, and then show me the events that are happening between them. So now, if this thing is dependent on that other thing and this thing, you can track them all really easily. You can also do things like check out the resources that are being created, and when an event happens that you really care about, you can kind of pause there and jump to this new thing. And we're constantly polling for new events, so when new event comes, we don't kind of kick you out. We'll say, hey, there are new events. Do you want to see them? So you don't kind of lose your place. This is really nice for nested stacks. I use nested stacks quite a bit. And this little toggle button, I'm sure that you can see little teeny right under there that says view nested. You can change it and you can only see parent stacks. So once all your stacks, nested stacks are done deploying, you can change it and you can say, only show me the parent stack. So you can reduce quite a bit of the clutter. We focused a lot on how can we make it so that customers who have a lot of stacks, 1,000+ stacks, can really easily manage their stacks and see different statuses and see different things. This is, I guess the best way to put it is this is the tip of the iceberg. We made a lot of underlying improvements to the console in general, as well as just CloudFormation, to make it so that things like this are easier. We can now build things a lot simpler. We can make changes. You'll see us continue to iterate quickly because of the underlying changes that we made.
All right. Yeah, that's when one of those changes behind the scenes is for performance. We have customers that have a ridiculous number of resources and stacks and everything. So just not only from a performance perspective and refreshing screens and so on and so forth, there's a lot of effort that has been put there. More effort will be put in. And this is kind of like a cornerstone to add a lot of other UX-specific features to CloudFormation in the future as well.
That's correct.
Let's talk about resources and coverage.
Yes. So as AWS continues to grow, it's growing at a ridiculous pace. We've added like over 1,900 new resources in 2018, major improvements in resources, and that's quite a bit. CloudFormation now supports over 400 resources. I think the number is like
421.
421 just recently. And as we've grown, we've realized that the tools that we have just aren't scaling well enough for customers' needs, right? We need to start, taking a look at where we can invest into making, new tools to make it so that we can improve our resource coverage. We just added a bunch of new resources recently, right? We added stuff like Greengrass is one of my favorites. If you haven't checked it out, please do. Another one of my favorites that I do for personal projects is the API Gateway WebSocket integration. Beautiful. But going back to it, we really needed a way to better improve the tooling and the services and the process to improve coverage as a whole.
Yeah, and adding, this is an area that we have a lot of discussions in the community in terms of like adding support. We love the fact that many of our CloudFormation customers will say, I don't care what AWS releases, if it's not supported in CloudFormation, it doesn't exist for us. And that's, shows the passion that they have for, yeah, there's one right there.
Anybody else?
Shows the passion that they have for doing the automation and doing the right process the right way. So as Dan mentioned, in the last year and a half, we've doubled that number of supported resources, but we're still, trying to speed up that process. You'll notice that a lot of these newer services we're releasing either with day one support or very close to day one support, and we're focused to close that gap as quickly as possible. One of the things that ties to this is we've had a discussion on Reddit for the last couple of months. We're going to come up with a public coverage roadmap. This focuses on coverage, on things that are already existing services and resource types. But the key parts of it that we're hoping to get out of this is, number one, more involvement from the community to point out to us which of those resources that we yet not support, which are the more critical ones, and speed that up. Second, perhaps get some feedback from the community as to, for this type of resource, it makes sense to implement it in this particular way. So this is an area that we're spending a lot of time internally in preparing for this roadmap and also preparing for some of these toolings. And one of the things that hopefully will be deliberate, that you'll hear in our talk today, not only about improving the programmability and CloudFormation in general, but also getting more community involvement, getting more community projects out there, getting you guys kind of like more involved to drive everything from new features to new coverage, although this will focus on coverage, drive where we spend our investment in terms of like dealing with some of these coverage gaps in CloudFormation. So hopefully much more new to come.
Before we move on, for this one, this is the same thing as the console, right? What you're going to see is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of work that actually went in to rethinking, how do we prioritize items? How do we get community voice involved? How do we see what items are the most popular, right? Internally, we do +1s, and we're probably going to bring some of the same methodologies over. It's really important for us to get the underlying processes right before actually releasing a product. And this is another one of those types of ideas.
Absolutely. So now let's kind of like shift gears to like enterprise type of management features in CloudFormation. Something that we announced in GA finally at reInvent in Vegas last year was drift detection, and we actually pre-announced it a year before. Just as curiosity of the CloudFormation users, how many of you have used drift detection yet? A fairly low number. For those of you that have not used it, the idea with drift detection is relatively simple. When you create something with CloudFormation, the best practices and the recommendation is manage that resource and manage changes to that resource only through CloudFormation, because that gives you the auditability, make sure that whatever the resource looks like is reflected on the template. However, in many companies, for a myriad of reasons, they will let people change the resource directly, especially if, for example, you have some kind of scalability, critical event or something like that. But now the configuration of the resource is going to look differently than what the CloudFormation metadata keeps on the stack and when you keep on your template code. So drift detection is an ability to go by stack or by resource and go out there and say, check if the configuration of this resource has drifted, has changed from the state that I put it in the last operation that I did on the stack. You can use it in the console. And like I mentioned before, most of our users are going to use it in the browser-based console, but you can also use it via CLI and SDKs. If you've never seen it, it uses kind of like a diff viewer once we do the analysis, which the analysis is essentially to say, let's look at the state that I've recorded out of that resource and stack, and then let's do list calls and describe calls and see what things have changed. So we can detect if something about the resource got deleted, if something about the configuration got added, or something about the configuration has changed. Unless you have like a very good vision and everything. The blue one is an example of the instance type changing from T2 micro to T2 nano. So you get the idea of like this particular configuration item has changed. How do we resolve it? In the future, we're hoping that we'll have some methods of remediation. We want to be very careful about doing that automatically, because imagine if you had a database that, or some storage that you had to increase from like 200 gigabytes to like half a terabyte or something like that, we don't want a remediation on drift to actually shrink that again. So a lot of our customers, we're going to be working with them as to how to best do remediation in an easier fashion. But for now, we want to concentrate on doing really good detection. There's a couple of ways that you can attack this. Number one, you can pretty much check for drift on demand by checking a particular stack at a particular resource. If you combine this with a rule that's available, if you're an AWS config user, you can actually have config periodically check on drift on your stack. So if, I don't know how often you would want to do it, but if you do want to check that way, you will be kind of like proactively checking for drift events, if you will. So looking ahead, we're looking at supporting more resources to maybe support about 50 or so of the most common resources, preventing false positives, which do happen sometimes, and we're getting a lot of feedback from customers on those, and then handling edge cases. So I strongly encourage you, if you haven't used this before, go ahead and use it and provide us feedback on it. Private link, this is something that we also released towards the end of last year. This gives you the ability to, as you're creating EC2 instances inside of a VPC, that we're able, via using a CloudFormation endpoint, to be able to route the information from the wait condition internal to your network. So it doesn't have to kind of like travel outside of the network to do this. So you don't require any proxies, network address translators, internet gateways, and it ultimately improves your security posture. So it's all about keeping this internal traffic, which really should be internal, inside of your AWS network that you specified. And again, this has been available now since the end of last year. So stack sets, how many of you use stack sets today? Okay.
Not too many.
Fairly few. We have, well, in the thousands right now, thousands of customers using stack sets in very large implementations. The idea with using stack sets is that you can take a stack and essentially duplicate that stack across accounts and across regions, or both. So if with one operation, you can take an existing stack and say, I want to put that in 3 regions and in 4 accounts into those regions. So you do the multiplication there, and it essentially creates 12 stack instances. We released this back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And since then, we've been adding a lot of improvements. Some of the things that you'll notice in terms of improvements that we've already done is we've done some limit increases to allow for 1,500 stack instances. You'll see those limits also continue to be expanded. We're also working on things like performance of those operations. One that I wanted to highlight today is this idea of overriding parameters, especially when you're making a lot of duplication and everything. And if you, for example, are putting something in 2 different regions, and it makes sense in one region to use a different timeout or a different instance type and everything, we still allow you to have the homogeneous part of the stack sets, but create custom overrides for some of the parameters as those stacks are deployed. Now let's talk a little bit about operational safety and improving the handling of secrets. Before we talk about secrets in particular, if you're not aware, we now support retrieving parameters directly from Systems Manager's parameter store. And you can retrieve plain text strings. You can retrieve global parameters. The second example here in red is an example of retrieving the default Amazon Linux AMI, or AMI. I don't know why people are so hung up about that. But rather than having to put a big mapping section and everything, they do vend the latest and greatest Amazon Linux one as a global variable. They also vend the Windows ones as a local global variable. And these are things that you can reuse then in CloudFormation and not keep this configuration on your template, which of course is one of the other best practices of don't hard code some of these things on templates. But the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about, well, another thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of like creating these parameters is that we now have something called dynamic references. In this particular example, I'm creating and defining a parameter, using up a parameter, and then referring to it on the template. With dynamic references, I can use this shorthand called bracket resolve, and that works for parameter store, secure parameters, and secrets manager as well. And now you save more code on your template. But now the fun part comes when you start talking about secrets. When you deal with secure strings, maybe some of you have seen a little bit of a template like this, where you have to put a user password to create, for example, an RDS DB instance or a cluster or one of those, and you have to put kind of like a dummy password there because you would not want to put the real one there. So now, rather than having to go through the gyrations of putting perhaps a dummy password, you can actually use the dynamic reference, supporting parameter store, supporting secure strings. So now you can keep that information safely on parameter store. Besides doing this with parameter stores, which is available to you at no additional cost, and it does provide some versioning, you can also use Secrets Manager. The benefits in using Secrets Manager is, of course, it can essentially help you automatically rotate your keys and everything. So dynamic references also works with Secrets Manager as well. If you're wondering about the format, it's bracket, bracket, resolve, the service itself, the parameter, the type of parameter, and then the parameter identifier. We'll continue also, our plans are to continue to improve this. I think it's resonated with some customers as well.
Quite a bit.
Now, let's pass it over back to you to talk about developer productivity.
Cool. This is an area that's really near and dear to my heart. I am a developer first. As much as they want me to be a developer advocate, the first word of that is developer. So I still continue to work on things like in my spare time, where I continue to use CloudFormations in my side projects. And here are some of the things that we've found out are the best practices for how to do things. If you put me in front of a language with Notepad, I'm pretty much useless. Right? I can't really do anything. I will mess up syntax everywhere. If I don't have a good linter, if I don't have a good formatter, I kind of guess I'll make mistakes. We want to do everything that we can as developers to make sure that we can put guardrails in front of ourselves, make things so that they're consistent across every developer, right? There are tools like Prettier and Black that automatically format code for you. There are things like ESLint that will, and a Python lint that will take and lint my code for me. So we thought maybe we should do something like this for CloudFormation as well. We have a tool for CloudFormation called CFN Lint, CFN Python Lint. It was made by a couple of folks from AWS and outside of the community. It's an open source tool that will take a look at your template and it'll say, hey, this thing is wrong. Hey, you have a template that, you have a parameter that's not really used anywhere. You have an instance type that is not a valid instance type list. You are referencing something that doesn't exist. It's a way to give you a second look over your shoulder to make sure that your template actually looks sane. It runs in a bunch of different editors. I use VS Code personally, but it can run in a headless mode, right? It runs via CLI command where you say, hey, CFN Python Lint, take a look at this template, tell me if it's okay. So you can put it in a thing like a pipeline, right? You can put it in a build step and say, hey, if you're doing a pull request, you must pass this type of linter. If not, we can't let you actually merge this in. It's really nice. It handles a bunch of different files. You can do things like conditions and FN ifs. There's a great SAM integration. And I think it's getting pretty popular now, right?
Yeah.
A bunch of people have started downloading it. It's over 100,000 downloads on GitHub. You're going to see on PyLint as well, or excuse me, pip, and we're seeing that number increase tremendously. This is just one of many tools that we have, right? There are different tools like CFN-NAG if you're security focused, but I personally use the linter basically all the time.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things to that. And like we suggested earlier, this is an example of before the linter existed, one of our a fairly common complaint from customers was, the validate API just simply doesn't catch a lot. It does just basic syntax of JSON or basic syntax of YAML and everything. And you know what? We kind of saw an idea from a couple of employees. We put it out there. Let's see what the community can do to improve this and everything. And we continue obviously to maintain it as well. But where the linter right now is compared to what you can do with validate API or when you do the validation when you upload, it's much more ahead than actually improving that on the CloudFormation side, to the point that I think you should expect in the future that we will start somehow syncing and using some of the linter technology on the back end. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. Number two, especially if you have a lot of template files, the linter can go out there, and when it's open, like in VS Code, for example, it can automatically link all the files in the directory. Number three, it leverages our resource spec, which not only the linter, but other tools that we're going to be talking about today also leverage that. And number four, we've gotten the question of, well, if I use the linter in my authoring and everything, then I don't need to use it also when I'm doing in pipelines, because you can use it in pipelines as well. And the idea, ideally, you would use it in both places, because that way you can guarantee that whoever perhaps hasn't found out about the linter among your CloudFormation users, and this can guarantee that if it passes the linter, then I'm going to even consider it to actually push it in the pipeline. And we'll talk about pipelines here again in a little bit.
The tools that we're making are really focused towards the open source community, right? So to say that, hey, you're doing a pull request, you must meet these minimum set of guidelines before we even consider merging it in. And it's all about that quick developer feedback loop, right? I want to know what my mistakes are before I actually submit to CloudFormation. I want to know locally that this thing is going to work. Another thing that we're doing on the resource spec that Luis was talking about is we just created what's called a template schema, right? As CloudFormation, we provide what's called a resource spec to customers to say, hey, these are all the resources we support in this region. These are all the properties. These are all the types. These are all the required properties, anything that's not required. These are how it kind of references other things. And we started building tools on top of that, where this one, for example, is an autocomplete. I can do a type of AWS : and it'll start spitting out all of the items that it can possibly look. I'll do an EC2 VPC CIDR ID as an example, and I hit properties, and it'll actually pop down and say, hey, you need a VPC ID for this as well. So I can know before I even try and submit it that this is the type of thing that's important. Another little secret thing is that if you mouse over the type, it pops up a little link to the documentation page. That's pretty nice. That makes it so that I don't have to go out and actually type, EC2 VPC CIDR ID. I can see it right there really quickly, and it reduces my feedback loop by quite a lot. And this is really like the first set of inroads that we're doing into the open source community. We want to be more involved in that community. We want customers to feel like they have ownership of some of the things that we're doing. We want to make it easier to author temps. We want to make it easier for people to make different types of plugins for our IDEs, just to make CloudFormation authoring.
Yeah, we want to get that multiplier effect, that not only do we give you better tools to not only use internally and even distribute internally, but also kind of like have some of these ideas from the community benefit as many users of CloudFormation as possible. So that, again, we're being very deliberate in this signal that we're investing in this area a lot.
And we really want to improve that template authoring experience. Now, TaskCat has become a big favorite of mine. It was made by the Quick Starts team. They were using it internally and decided, let's open source this. Again, this is another one of the initiatives that we have at AWS to be more part of the open source community. TaskCat is nice because a lot of the times you're pretty sure that your template's going to run, but you're not really sure until you actually press the button, you go into the console, you do whatever CLI command. Most of the times, this is not quite what you want. You want to know that it runs. So TaskCat will take your template, it'll deploy it out with some fake name, you can pass it a couple fake parameters, it'll wait till it goes all the way through to complete, and then it spins it back down. So now that I know my CloudFormation template has spun up and also then spun down successfully. It's really good to have to clean up after itself. If, for example, you make one that doesn't quite go all the way, it'll clean up after itself, go all the way back, make sure that it's a nice and clean environment. So this makes it so that before I even commit my template, I have like a really nice automated way of saying, yeah, this is going to work. I can have another step in my build tool chain, right, that says, hey, before you even try and make this pull request, it has to pass TaskCat. TaskCat also has this ability to deploy your stack to not only one region, but to many regions, right? Maybe some little insidious thing that you may not have thought of. Maybe I want to deploy this to US East 1 and, I don't know, NRT, and say, hey, this service doesn't actually exist in RT. We're going to try and deploy it. It's going to fail. This doesn't actually exist. We can't actually do this successfully. Oh, cool. Guess we can't go to Japan quite yet. It is a really nice way of catching things that you may not have just initially thought of, right? And the best part is that it works part of a build tool chain. It'll tell you, yes, it passed. No, it didn't. You can go on. You can't go on. It's all about like building nice guardrails around your pipeline to make sure that when we go to production, we're safe. Right? CloudFormation is all about being safe and repeatable, and that's what we're trying to bring to our tooling as well.
Yeah, a couple of things to add to that. It's pretty clever how it actually goes and creates stacks and everything and runs some tests and then cleans up after itself, so that you don't leave kind of like a lot of stuff. As you're running your tests, you don't leave a lot of stuff, taking away, cost and everything for you. The other thing is, especially for GovCloud users and everything, as you know, some things might not make it to GovCloud at the same time they make it to other regions. This is the kind of thing that you can kind of like spin off and run in GovCloud, because really this is something you install yourself. I think it's Python based as well. Yep. And so you can use it on all regions, whether they're government regions or not as well. Okay, so tell me how to put this all together.
Great. Pipelines. I am a big proponent of pipelines. Whenever I start a CloudFormation project, the first thing that I build is my pipeline, right? I make it so that I have this nice way to go from sourcing to building to deploying, so that the first time I make a commit, it goes to my development environment, and then it's really easy. I save myself a lot of time in the long run without having to run that command every single time. Instead, I just commit, make sure that everything goes through, and iterate a lot quicker. It's all about that getting to that fast development loop cycle where I can commit and go to development very quickly, commit, go to prod, right, very safely. That's what we're really aiming at here. I have a link to a CI/CD pipeline that I made. I have a couple of different events that I go to, and I actually talk about this, so feel free. We're going to have our Twitter at the end, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, where you can follow and you can check that out. The ones that I use AWS Code Commit, AWS Code Build, and Code Pipeline, just because they're easy to spin up with CloudFormation, but you don't have to only use that. We support open source tools as well. We support GitHub, we support Travis. Any way that you want to actually build your pipeline, you can do so. So let's give an example, right? I'm a developer, I make my template, I commit it into my source control. That's something that apparently folks don't do as much as I thought. That's something we really want to push. Source your templates, right? Their code, their infrastructure is code. We're working with code here. The first thing you do is you source it. From there, a build step triggers. A build step is going to take what you just sourced, take a look at it, and run a couple of tests against it, right? It'll run CFN lint. In my example, it'll run TaskCat. Maybe you're a little bit more security focused. You want to run CFN nag. Maybe you have a couple of Lambda functions in there. Do some unit tests, right? This is all just regular code that's being built.
I think one of the key things that I want to signal on this is that, although we've been talking about DevOps for it has to be at least 10 years and CI/CD pipelines, forgetting about CloudFormation for a second, half of all people are still not using that and not getting advantage of the automation and the deployment speed and the deployment control, the predictability. What we're trying to say is, if you're not heavily using this, use it, and not only use it, but also integrate your CloudFormation infrastructure part of it into it as well. You can have infrastructure-only pipelines. You can have pipelines that actually include the infrastructure code with your application code, and in many cases that might be more ideal for you. But the idea here is we're setting up CloudFormation to help you not only implement CloudFormation best practices, but deployment best practices in general. So if you're not doing this now, we're very focused on doing the changes necessary to parts of CloudFormation to enable you to do CI/CD with infrastructure as code. Yeah,
and part of our job is to make the ops person the least busy person in the office.
There you go.
Right. I want to make your job as simple as I can. Go back real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not quite done yet. Still got a lot more to talk about. I love pipelines.
We do need to leave today.
You guys don't mind staying a couple extra hours? We're good. So with the actual pipeline, we've committed it, so we have a good way to roll back if we need to. We have a good audit list of what changed. We've built it, and we've tested it, so we know that this is going to deploy to production. Let's actually go to production. There are a couple of different things that we can do. Code Pipeline has a wonderful integration with CloudFormation, where you can say, hey, Code Pipeline, you know what, go ahead, deploy to prod. That's fine. Or you can say, maybe that's fine for dev and test, but for prod, I want to generate a change set. I want somebody to manually go in there and say, looks fine to me. Or maybe you just want to spin up a new stack entirely. We have a bunch of different ways to do that. And one of the nice things about CloudFormation and pipelines is that it's really good for the open source community as well. One of the slickest integrations that I saw that I thought was super cool is, as a team, one team, when somebody makes a commit, it actually takes all of the CloudFormation templates, spins up a brand new environment, and boom, you have a UAT environment spun up with no work from you. Somebody goes in, checks, everything runs, everything makes sure. Now we know with absolute, as much safety as we can go to production. That is really nice, really slick. How many of you have ever been scared of going to production? Me all the time, I'm terrified. But what if I can make it simple and easy, and you can do 10, 15, 20 painless deployments to production all the time?
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is something that, of course, as a best practice, although many people that are using CloudFormation for instances and everything cannot have immutable service, of course, that's one of the areas that whenever you can get to immutability, that's another best practice as well. Let's talk about macros and the kind of like the layers of programmability that we're trying to add here.
Yeah, so customers have a bunch of options when it comes to CloudFormation and generating their templates. Some folks choose to use DSLs, right? They choose to use things like Troposphere, Sparkle Formation, and they want to continue to have that like extra ability to do some more complex things. And we're adding a new one called the CDK. I think you'll be talking about that a little later, right? Mm-hmm. For folks like me, I really like the simple nature of declarative templates, right? I really like to be able to go into a template and say, oh, this does this, this does that, this does this. I don't have to wrap my mind around, oh, what is this going to actually generate out into? So for folks like me, they've actually built a tool called macros. Customers always ask us, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had more intrinsic functions? Yeah, it would be. So we allow you to build your own. We say, hey, you tell us what it looks like, you tell us what it actually does, and we can allow you to run it. You can create loops, for example. You can do things like take a look at the template that's going to be generated out. Does this look right? If it doesn't, maybe we don't let it go. And you can share this either across stacks, you can share this across other developers, you can share this across the open source community. This allows customers to have like really, really fine-grained control over what people can do easily in your templates, right? We'll say, hey, maybe you don't really want to deploy this thing that is in a public S3 bucket. Maybe we want to say, nah, you can't do that. This allows you the ability to say, maybe we don't want to let this stack go through.
All right.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to walk through a few examples here, and we picked out examples that on purpose, because these are some of the things that customers have talked to us in the past and said, boy, I really wish the language supported this, or I really wish I could do this in the middle of the template while my template's getting executed, et cetera, et cetera. So go over a couple of them, and I'll go and capture a couple of them later.
Absolutely. So let's actually jump into Iterator. Don't look too hard at this code. All that I want to show you is that it's really not that big. It's not this whole huge deployment that you have to do. It's a couple of lines of code. What, maybe 50 lines of code, and we can actually create an iterator. We can say, if you jump to the next slide, we can actually say, hey, I want to deploy this iterator. I want to deploy it in a serverless function, because it's just a Lambda function. That's all it is. It's really simple. Just Lambda function. Deploy it with serverless. And a small little tidbit here. I don't know if you guys can see this up at the top. It's a transform. A transform is really just a macro. We kind of just hid it away, right? So serverless is just a macro. That's how we use it.
Yep.
Go ahead to the next one. So taking a look at the macro, this is what the left side is what the macro is actually going to say, right? I just want to make S3 bucket with a count of 3. On the right, what's actually going to spit out? It's going to spit out 3 S3 buckets, right? Same thing with the SQ. The important thing to note here is that you can make it as simple or as complex as you need it to be. Sometimes you want it to conform to some naming convention that you have, where I want it not to be bucket 1, but bucket ONE 1. Whatever your use case is, you have that fine-grained control into actually making that Lambda function be as simple or as complex as you need to, right? Here's a really good one that I'm a big fan of. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just arbitrarily run Python commands while CFN's generating your template, right? You'll say, hey, there's some nice API that I can actually grab my tags from. So you actually make that API call and say, give me all the tags, and you actually spit out the tag into your CloudFormation template. That's a really nice way of generating tags consistently across your organization. Why not? We'll support it. It's a good idea. And the string functions, right? Sometimes I want my strings to be all lowercase. For example, Athena databases can only work in lowercase. I found this out the hard way, right? And I could make it so that all of my templates are always lowercase, or I could just create a macro that does that for me. I'm kind of lazy. I'm a developer, right? That's what we do. We try to do as little work as possible. So I made a little macro that says, hey, make this lowercase, make this uppercase. You can do a whole bunch more things with that. And the important thing is, if you look at the input string, we actually ref a parameter. So your parameter will be already resolved by the time that you get it. We have a bunch of them. For example, we do upper, we do lower, capital. Even more, if you want to generate a random jumbled string, you can do that too. We'll give you all the access that you need to do it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll highlight as I look at the last couple of examples here from macros is that we're trying to strike a balance, and transforming CloudFormation is not a new thing. Many customers, even before we released this, were using things like Jinja, which other people use in other tools as well. And that's great, and you can continue to use that. But we're trying to help people not only do it in kind of like a more native way, but also strike the balance between, there's going to be the majority of CloudFormation users tend not to be heavy-duty coders. There's a good element of them that are, and for those people using CDK, which I'm going to talk a little bit about here, just mentioning it, makes a lot of sense. Many of the users are just not that comfortable with that kind of coding. With macros, not only can some of them actually perhaps get into some of the Lambda and everything without having the overhead of using custom resources, because setting up macros is actually a lot easier than using custom resources. But the other part of it is you can get into an environment where you may have a more limited set of users vend some macros and then tell people you can use these macros, but you don't need to worry about the Lambda and the stuff that's behind them and everything. So you can strike the best of both worlds, having the flexibility and the programmability and still not necessarily force everybody to become a Lambda expert just to use CloudFormation. The two examples that I wanted to talk about is this will give you like a global variable setting at the beginning of the template, and then the code to actually implement that, it's once again using Lambda. I'm using Python. It's relatively small. Besides this utilities like running Python and creating an iterator, here's a really interesting use case where you can say, for example, every time that I create an S3 bucket, I want you to make sure that there's an access policy associated with it. And every time you create a bucket, create these two resources as well. Well, you can create a macro that can do that. Obviously, as we showed before, we can support macros that can run just automatically or macros that actually take input parameters as well. Here's an example of we can make it so that, oh, by the way, make sure that the default stuff happens when an S3 bucket happens, and all this stuff on pink is actually generated automatically or transformed into the template. The code is a little bit more complicated, and of course, I'm not going to make you read it or anything like that. And then you can set up like a defaults file. Your macros can also use side files or assets to actually be configurable as well for different use cases. I was looking at the time. Let's talk a little bit about CDK, Cloud Development Kit. It's been in preview now for a few months. It's getting a lot of good attention. And before CDK existed, some of these options existed as well. Things like for Python developers, you could use Troposphere, a very mature project that will continue to be used out there. They're leveraging also our resource specification that we talked about before. There's an option for Ruby. There's an option for a couple other languages. This it's designed by the builder team in AWS, and it supports multiple language bindings. I think the initial one was TypeScript and JavaScript. I've seen the Python one in dev preview, and there'll be others. But beyond just kind of like starting from the high-level language and generating CloudFormation templates, it does a lot more. It helps you package CloudFormation applications, if you will, in such a way that there's a lot of abstraction that is possible. For example, if you had to create a VPC, you can do it with 1 or 2 lines of code, and it generates all the dependent resources for that. Similar to what we do with serverless transforms, you can create a function and it generates a lot of the extra cruft for you, if you will. And if you're keeping track on this project on GitHub, they have like type level 1 and level 2 abstractions, and that's pretty much grown a lot because of the community involvement on it. So if you put it kind of like in perspective here, as we talked about at the beginning, we're trying to give CloudFormation customers and users as many programmability options as possible, not force all of them to be very versed on a fairly complex or higher level language. Also kind of like appreciating the benefits of declarative programming. So kind of like you can pretty much slide in where you are today and then take steps to either get into macros, get into custom resources, and leverage some of those improvements, all go all the way into CDK and more advanced programming.
Right.
Making those developers a lot more productive.
Yeah.
You want to add anything to that?
But before you move on, one of the things that I like about this is I used Jinja a lot in the past. I used Troposphere as well. One of the things I like about CDK is, and the same thing in the same arena, is it's really easy to abstract away some of the difficulty of CloudFormation. Writing a CloudFormation template is not, right? There's a little bit of a learning curve to that, right? You can abstract it away and just say, hey, if you want to spin up your own VPC, here is the package that you use to import it into your CDK file, and you just say, my company secure VPC.
Yeah,
done.
absolutely.
It's really simple to use. It abstracts away some of the learning curve, and it just allows developers to really quickly, spin things up without having to become experts at it. Now, we suggest you become experts at it. This is a tool that you're going to hopefully leverage as your company
learning
matures.
stuff's not going to hurt you in any way.
Yeah, but it's just a nice way to get over that little that barrier of people being, I don't really want to learn something new. Okay, here you go. Use this, learn it. But this is a nice little interim step. It's like a little stepping stool.
Absolutely. All right, so let's kind of summarize, and again, I want to highlight some of the themes that I mentioned at the beginning. First, about programmability. You got CDK, you got macros, you got custom resources already, and we're looking at some improvements on that area as well, so stay tuned for that. But making those CloudFormation coders, infrastructure as code coders, a lot more productive is a big area of emphasis for us. For enterprises, trying to promote those best practices by allowing them to keep parameters and versions of parameters outside of the configuration of the code, using things with parameter store, doing secure strings remotely in a way that really does not compromise your security in any way, improving and releasing drift detection and stack sets. We have a lot of improvements in the pipeline for that, once again, in terms of like performance and scalability. And then continuing to improve the base of the product, the interface. We very much encourage you to give us feedback on the updated interface. One thing that hopefully, again, it came across, the linter, CDK, the template schema, TaskCat, a lot of open source activity there and a lot of community activity. We really want to kind of like open things up, and again, if for no other reason, just to pretty much speed up the improvements in CloudFormation as much as we can. And obviously, a big part of that is getting more feedback on what are the more critical coverage gaps that you guys see out there, so we can invest more time sooner on those as well.
And yeah,
go ahead.
I want to touch on something that Luis went on there. Feedback is super important to us, right? Feedback actively shapes what our roadmap looks like. When we have team meetings, what are we going to work on next? The first thing that we bring up is what are customers asking for? The console was a great one. We took what the customers were asking for, we built it. We scheduled time. We said, no, this other stuff they're working on, not as important as what customers want. And that's the AWS way, right? And we continue that at CloudFormation. Your feedback, your voice is very important to us. So please let us know. Mm-hmm.
One thing that I want to highlight before we leave today is this slide right here, besides saying thank you, and we really do appreciate it. My Twitter handle is Luis Colon1. Dan's is the Dan Blanco.
That's right.
But I want you to take a look at that, because one of the things that we're doing with the community is we established a Slack channel that we can have the community essentially help each other and talk to each other. We did this at the beginning of summer of last year, and in a year we now have over 1,100 users, including many people from AWS, helping each other out. If you're interested and are not on the Slack channel yet, send a Twitter direct message to either one of us, and we'll send you an invite via email, send us your email. We would love to see you guys join and get the benefit from that. Just another option, another kind of like touch point to get in touch with us. So by all means, please, if you're interested, we'd love to have you there. And finally, two last things. Do one of these so that we go back and try to improve this thing and try to talk slower or jump more or
That's
whatever.
That's one of the pieces of feedback that I got.
We really do want you to give us some feedback, and we literally read every single one of them, even in very, very large sessions. And the last statement, thank you so much for taking the time to come here. Really appreciate it.